Hi, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon artist talk with Annie MacDonell, Maïder Fortuné, and Daniella Shreir, hosted by the Robert McLaughlin Gallery. The RMG is in the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation. This land has been the traditional territory of the Michisaga since 1700, and before that time, it was stewarded by various communities belonging to the Haudenosaunee and Wendat confederacies. This area is covered under the Williams Treaties and the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, and continues to be home to many Indigenous people. The RMG is committed to recognizing and acting on the responsibilities we have as a team to share, the responsibilities that we share as a team to protect the land and redress the ways colonialism has shaped our organization. My name is Hannah, and I'm the Associate Curator, Public Programs at the RMG. I'm grateful for the opportunity to gather with you all this afternoon and to welcome our guests who are joining us from Toronto, London, and Paris. From my home office, the snow has been falling steadily out the window. And as the first days of winter approach, I've been reminded how nourishing it is to gather and talk with each other. I wanted to take a moment to thank Annie, Maïder, Daniella for welcoming all of us into this conversation about the work in Annie's show, The Beyond Within, and specifically the collaborative work that Annie and Maïder created together. The Beyond Within is a touring exhibition curated by Crystal Mowry and Leila Timmins. The show includes work from roughly the last 5 years of Annie's practice, including 2 collaborative works with Maïder, Out There for Lee Lozano and Communicating Vessels. While there are pivotal works in this exhibition that explore friendship and art making, they have also had a life of their own outside of the gallery, having been screened at festivals internationally. The themes explored in these films, including collaboration and escaping the self, the isolation of the self, these themes reverberate across the rest of the exhibition. If you haven't had a chance yet to see it, The Beyond Within is currently installed at the Robert McLaughlin Gallery until February 13th, 2023. Welcome to all 3 of you. Thank you again for being here. Yeah. Would you like to say a few words first, or do you want me to cue up a clip of the film?
Sure, we can say a couple words, maybe just to set up the films. We're going to have a conversation about the 2 works, but we thought just in case people don't know the films or haven't seen them in a while, we would start with a clip from the very beginning of Communicating Vessels and a clip from the very beginning of Out There, just so that there are some sort of images that we can then refer back to.
I first met E on the day she showed up to my intro to film class. She appeared one morning halfway through the term and planted herself in the center seat of the front row, a place students generally avoided at all costs. But E wouldn't have known this unspoken rule, nor would she have cared about it if she did. E was an unusual girl, even by the standards of an art school. She dressed in shapeless skirts and pants, collared blouses, ugly sneakers. She didn't look anything like the rest of the kids at the school, but none of this bothered her in the least. In fact, she moved through the world with a self-confidence that bordered on arrogance. The day she arrived, we were watching experimental film from the 1970s, one of my favorite things to teach. The artists, now either long dead or grown old and famous, appeared on camera as their younger selves. Usually they were alone, performing strange rituals in their crude but impossibly large studio spaces. At the time the works were made, it was radical to present art and life as being inseparable and equivalent. So even the smallest gesture was loaded with political potential. Often, because of the single camera setups and the long, continuous shots, watching these films was like watching time passing in real life, but not real life now, real life back then.
Lee Lozano was born on November 5th, 1930. At 4:25 p.m. in Newark, New Jersey. She died on October 2nd, 1999 in Dallas. Lozano was, by her account and in the words of others, a Scorpio, an artist, a loner, a lover, a stoner, a dropout, a wormhole.
Hannah? Hannah, are you there?
Yes,
You want to just download that and we can maybe watch?
sure.
Okay, maybe we can just start by talking about communicating vessels and then we can
Yeah, sure.
watch the Out There clip afterwards. Sorry about that.
Yeah, sure. Hi. Can you hear me because of my terrible sound situation? Okay.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask you, obviously both films, one of which we haven't seen a clip of, but there's so many different formal layers. So I thought it would be useful to talk about the first layer, the material with which you started for both projects. What was the initial interest in both works? What was the seed, I guess?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll start. Maïder, interrupt me whenever you want.
Yeah, sure.
With communicating vessels, we actually started with the metaphor of the communicating vessels much earlier than long before we arrived at the story and the narrative that ended up being the material of the film. We were talking a lot about the complicated ways that things can interrelate with each other. And we came across this description of the scientific experiment of the communicating vessels, which is essentially if you have two vessels that are linked in a specific way and you pour fluid into one of them, they will pass the fluid back and forth within the two vessels in order to maintain equivalent levels within the vessels. And we really liked that idea of sort of like perpetual exchange and also two things being linked and sharing a common material, which I think we were able to use as a metaphor for a lot of different things from, our collaborative practice to much more formal things like the kinds of relationships we wanted to establish between text and image in the film. That came really early on, that we wanted this unstable relationship between what was being spoken and what was being shown on screen, where like elements could move back and forth between those two separate vessels. I guess we were thinking of them. Maïder,
Yeah, there was also a very more like personal and very feminine, I guess, idea was the fact that we felt like we were around our 40s and like 40s being a moment where you can actually feel time going in two directions and like your 20s, but actually also your 70s as something that is very new that happened to both of us that we talked about when you reach the middle of your 40s. And so thinking that that moment was really precious, actually, in terms of time dynamics. And I think the idea of time and like the past, present, future circulating and not being linear was something that was both really interesting in terms of film, of course, because we are both filmmaker, but also really grounded into like our experience of being teachers, mothers, ex-students, and like feeling all that was so like in the reach of our mind and whatever. So that was really, I think, special too. So we ended up with this kind of map, constellation map, where we had all these elements that we knew were connected in some ways, even if they didn't seem like totally connecting, but at some point through another element, they could be connected. So it was really working like a map. And we knew there was so many like, whatever, ties that need to be made between all these elements. And then so we worked a lot on these notions, and I think we also, it came kind of quickly, the fact like because of the past, present, future activation, the 70s performance came, and then in the very, very end, we got the story as a way to link all that, all these elements and all the material that we, Yeah,
it's true. The story sort of came last. We had all these things. We had the metaphor of the communicating vessels, and we had all these ideas and experiences we wanted to activate. And then we had, at a certain point, I think we had about 4 or 5 stories that were like shortlisted for being the main narrative of the film. And then we just decided that through one, we could probably link up the ideas best.
mm-hmm.
So I think we'll carry on with communicating vessels for now. But I'm interested in the sort of the idea of pedagogy, which you touched upon, both as a student and as a teacher. And I was wondering, in terms of the communication that happens in communicating vessels between teacher and student, was there a particular dynamic that interested you there? Because for me, I think that what's so interesting is this kind of reversal in a way, in terms of, well, a kind of taboo, right, where the teacher is fascinated and wants to know more about the student. So you could just speak a little to that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess like also this pedagogy, I mean, we spend a lot of time working without that. So I think like, I think it was also a desire to work with our own life and our own whatever experience. So, and of course we're both teachers, and we know that the dynamics are complex, and it's not just like you can be totally obsessed with your students. And when you spend so much time thinking about work, the work is also becoming, you process it yourself. So the work is also contaminating you, and that the power dynamic is not just like one way. And so all these, and also we wanted, I mean, we're totally aware that it's very specific to art school also, this type of relationships. I mean, art school allowing some kind of, very personal relationship, with also all the problems that it can bring, and all the lack of, the way institution deals with whatever illness. And so, I mean, like all that is, was, very close to us, I guess. And maybe we thought we could, ground the story on that, and it was definitely one relationship, and it's not the only one in the film, but it's like the first one in the foreground, and that was like allowing us to actually build up a story and characters upon that.
Yeah, I think also it links back to what Maïder was saying in the beginning about us talking about this sort of like double perspective of being in the middle of your life, where you feel equally connected to younger versions of yourselves, but suddenly you can project yourself into much older versions of yourself. So I think we wanted to do that with the film, And, we got to know each other as art students. So I think that's the sort of context that's always circulating between us, that sort of like very intense connection that happens within those, messy and productive and destructive spaces of school, of art school. But I think also it had to do with with us trying to get at the circulation of ideas and images, which I think happens in a really special way in art and literature and music, in that things circulate between people, and that can happen over, it doesn't just happen in a direct way, it happens directly between people within a community, but it also happens over huge expanses of time where an image can be made and it can resurface again 40 years later, or 100 years later, or some images drop off altogether, and an image that appears in the present can totally like recontextualize an image that we might have read in a different way from the past before that new image appears. So I think we are also interested in, of all the roles that the student plays in the narrative. She, at one point, the film goes on from this introduction to cycle through all the works that the student is making. And a lot of those works are works that we pulled from the sort of early moment of performance and conceptual art in America in the 60s and 70s, mostly in America, I guess. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to take some of those images and artworks that had really shaped the way both of us approach art making, and then attribute them to a student. So it's sort of like, reversing that sort of like masterwork, student work relationship, and showing the way that, these ideas and images move between us, all of us.
Yeah, I'm interested. I mean, I guess just in terms of the last thing you said, of you taking these, you've got, who is it, Joan Jonas? Who are the other two artists that you?
Oppenheim.
Dennis Oppenheim and Lygia Clark, yeah.
Yeah, and Oppenheim, you said, you talked about how this was initially him and his two children, right? And then you've just changed it so that it's one woman transmitting to another woman, then to the wall. I'm kind of interested in how there's always a kind of not quiteness in terms of the way that you guys use work with reenactment or recreation, which kind of speaks, I think, to an impossibility of kind of reading biographies, of kind of ever being able to penetrate a historical figure's life or psyche. So yeah, it would be interesting to maybe talk about imperfection or like not quite ever getting there, if that's interesting to you.
Sure. Do you think we should watch the intro to the Out There? Maybe that.
Yeah, because I think that's yeah, that would be great if we can.
And is that possible now?
Lee Lozano was born on November 5th, 1930, at 4:25 p.m. in Newark, New Jersey. She died on October 2nd, 1999, in Dallas. Lozano was, by her account and in the words of others, a Scorpio, an artist, a loner, a lover, a stoner, a dropout, a worm watcher, an anorexic, a masturbator, an art dreamer, a monster, an infomaniac, an adventuress, a paranoiac. In the beginning of her career, she drew, and then she painted, and then she abandoned almost everything in favor of a series of radical life art experiments, which she documented with intensity and precision in her private notebooks from 1968 to 72. In the middle of these experiments, she was invited to speak at NASCAD, the art college in Halifax that was a hub for conceptual art at that time. One of her few solo shows was held in the school's mezzanine gallery in January, and in July she came to give a talk to students. Her proposal was for a day-long event titled Halifax Three-State Experiment. She would deliver the talk in 3 states: sober, stoned on weed, and high on acid. She began the day sober on campus in the classroom. Then she moved the class to nearby Point Pleasant Park to smoke weed and continue the talk there. Finally, she relocated to someone's house where she took acid and concluded her talk to however many students remained as the day closed out and the acid took effect. We know that Lozano's Halifax 3-state experiment began at 10 a.m. and concluded at sunset, which according to the internet happened at 8:57 p.m. on that day in July 1971. So we have a beginning point and an end point, and we have a rough idea of what transpired between the two, but the details and documentation are partial at best. We know where she was for each part of the day, but not what she did there or how long she stayed. There are the audio recordings, but they only cover part of the day. There's the unreliable timekeeping provided by the periodic photographs of her pupils expanding over the course of the experiment as she meshed with various substances, people, and places. And there are also a few details recounted by those who took part in the original event. These bits and pieces give us a structure of sorts, a loose constellation of information to work within. But there could be other markers as well, less reliable time structures that might better equip us to do what we want to do here, which is to produce new forms from the old, living elements out of the dead, like in Frankenstein when the bits and pieces of cadavers are joined together and reanimated in the night. In Frankenstein, the binding medium was electricity. In our experiment, we'll use images and words and sound and the surface of the movie screen and time itself.
Thanks, Hannah.
So
Daniella.
you were talking, oh, sorry. So yeah, I don't know. I can start with the idea of I think it's really, I think Annie and I are very interested in or attached to the idea of instability, I guess, or like the dynamic of things, and so yeah, instability as not being static or as not being fixed, and this can be, I think that's one of the motto of a lot of our strategies in a way. And you, I mean, like, obviously, like the masks that we've just seen, you know, who are not totally there, but they're there, but not there, or like, you know, they don't fit. And it's the same with communicating vessel. There is this digital mask that doesn't really fit, that doesn't really like, it pulls the, you know, the face of the woman, but still they're like possible ways of expanding yourself or inflating yourself. And I do believe it's like something that I mean, on just based on the identity, I totally feel like all the relationship that we have with all these women that we are totally in love with, like all these outsiders, that's also like important for us, that was so nourishing us. It's, I guess, the relationship that you have with all these possible selves. And in the same way, like when you have students next to you, like there are all these possible selves, all these possible, and it's the same when you're student and you know, you have all these, you know, people around you, and you look at them and you like think, you know, is it like me, or am I like that, or not like that? And I think it's also something very women do. They talk about a lot about like, you know, their self, and like they know like their friends, and like I feel like that's both very, very yeah, I don't know, like profound way of entouré, I don't know how to say, you know.
Circling.
Yeah, you have all these, you know, like we have all these figures, you have all these artists, you have these artworks, you have these people, you have these figures, you know, and all that is like, you know, it's a way of not looking at, you know, all the potentiality of all these relations. And so that's more like on the identity and how like we insist in these two works, but like identity being like not fixed and like something that is not stable and everything. And I guess all this non-stability is really also in terms of other strategies, or like what you see, what you hear is not what you see. Like you hear about like one character, but then you see two actresses. So it's not like, you know, it's just doesn't, there's no like identicality in between this stuff. Or even like in Communicating Vessel, like the teacher is seeing like want to see a white page in the ledger clock, and the girl is saying that it's not white, and what you see on the film is totally like it's white. And so like we contradict, like we manage all this contradiction, we manage all this complexity. And I think that's really what we are trying to do, is to keep things like, to keep relationship dynamic and not like static, as a, I guess, as a real deep political way also, I think, of making stuff, you know, or thinking about narrative too. I don't know, Annie, maybe you want to.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I think also there's a sense of, like, Daniella, you were asking about our relationship to these past works and past figures that were sort of like half evoking or convoking, but not fully realizing. I think it has to do also with maybe like not treating them as like, not doing it in like a post-mortem way, like treating them as if they're still living things that are still open for, you know, like not things that are closed off and finalized, but things that can still recirculate and be reinvented and be broken apart, which, you know, it maybe comes back to that metaphor of the communicating vessels too.
Yeah, I wonder, I mean, maybe we could talk about formally in terms of the organization of all of these layers, in terms of, like you were saying about the slippages between text and image and the not quiteness in terms of those things matching up. And in the Lee Lozano especially, it's so textually rich. There's so much going on that like you can't read the image and listen to the words at the same time. And then maybe this is more a question about editing in terms of the organization of materials. Actually, maybe it's best to go back and ask you about your research methodology for the Lee Lozano piece and all of the various different things that you looked at, and then we can move on, I think, to the organization of that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we spent a lot of time researching the Lozano film, not because we were trying to be, not because we were like pursuing some kind of thoroughness, but just because we were so really, really deeply interested in her. And there's at once there's like so little about her, but everything that remains to be accessed is so rich, like all of her private notebooks. So Lozano was first a painter, and then she had this very, very active period in sort of 68 to 72 when she abandoned painting and began these sort of performative life artworks, where everything that she did in her daily life became an artwork that was just documented by writing them down. And sometimes those writings, those descriptions were presented in galleries as drawings, but sometimes they just stayed in her notebook too. And recently all of her private notebooks were published as facsimiles. So we had access to all of that information, and that was great. There just seemed like there was so much that we were actually a bit overwhelmed by it. And that's why we ended up focusing on this talk that she gave in NASCAD in Halifax in 1971. And for that, we had to do a bit more digging and go back to the estate and the archives to try to find as much photographs and information about it as possible. Is there anything that you want to say about the research?
Yeah, I guess also this talk was because we were so into the notebooks, and we had, you know, the notebooks were like the primary archives that we were into. And the talk was really striking because we could hear her voice, and we didn't even think that there would be a possibility to actually listen to her. And it was also a very different setting. Like it was such like a formal moment, you know, that was so different from all the notebooks that we were reading. And also it was also like this moment of pedagogy that was, yeah. So we decided to.
Maybe you could speak a bit to what is in the notebooks, just for those that haven't seen the film.
The notebooks it's basically a record of her daily life. And some things are pretty obsessive, like she, makes lists of everything that she ate, or everybody she had sex with, or the things that were said in conversations with friends or with enemies. And then also these performative gestures. She spent a lot of time alone. She had a big loft on Grand Street that was really important to her. And she spent a lot of time in there. You feel like it's this sort of like bubble that she lived in by herself. And then she was sort of like constantly, like, the thing with the worm that is at the beginning of the Lozano film was like a good example of that. She bought weed, and in the weed there was this little orange worm. And then she just like obsessively watched and documented the worm for, 2 or 3 days until he died. And so there's like, several pages about the worm, right up until the point where, he dies, and then she dries him out and she grinds him up and she smokes him too. So it's this sort of like these performative gestures that are really on the verge of her just living her life. But she also gave herself a specific goal. She was really great with language and really inventive with language. And she loved puns, and they're really funny. And a lot of them are really crude too, and rude, and she can be totally eviscerating. And she can be, generous and hilarious too. So they're supposed to be her private notebooks, but you also feel at the same time that she is addressing somebody else. It doesn't feel like she's talking to herself. You feel like she's kind of like framing up these moments in her private life for some kind of public consumption, even though at the same moment she was progressively sort of removing herself from the art world. So that was the content. And then, like Maïder said, when we stumbled on the archive, the audio recording of her voice, it was a big revelation for us. And I think the way that we tried to activate those things in the book, or in the film rather, was to, like keep them unstable. And, of course it's tempting when you have these great images and the audio archive to, like, we all know what a archival film looks like, what a sort of documentary approach would have been to the material. But we wanted to keep it living and keep it unstable. And always also sort of keep our work as the filmmakers as part of the context too, so that we never sort of disappear. You feel us sort of sifting through the material.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've even got the visual representation of that research in the part where you sort of go through the inventory of terms in a very thorough, methodological, obsessive way. And it actually appears on the screen as a process. You see the process of research visually manifested. I guess back to my question about editing or organizing those different layers, but also, first of all, I wanted to ask how you guys work as you're researching. Do you get tempted into discussing an idea for how that will work, things will work visually as you go, or are you very much into collating, collecting, researching, and then sitting down? How does it work?
I think it's I think it's as messy as you would guess from looking at the images that we make. I think everything is happening simultaneously. It's very I think it's metabolized, more like metabolizing something than research. It's not like the way an academic would research. It's, we're ingesting in order to secrete, So I think some of the secretion happens all along the way.
And in terms of editing, back to my question of editing,
yeah, I think I think the edit is also part of the writing. I think it's I think the writing is more in both of the films. It's really about having different different languages or different grammar working at the same time. it's linked to what we were saying earlier on about like this instability of format I think it's really linked also to our connection to narrative, because I would not say that our works are essays at all. But at the same time to like to see how we can fuck it up, fuck up with these big codes, so like archival film for Lozano or narrative film for Communicating Vessel. And so I think the edit is totally part of a strategy, like is really, I mean, like in anything, editing is writing, but I think for us it's really identifying structures or gameplays. And so then like in Lozano we got these different parts, and of course the parts were in the experiment that had 3 stages, but it was also about like how do we rewrite above. So we mix also the timing, there's the time of the archive, the time of the present, what do we do with that? And so I mean it's also, I guess, being very attentive to the relation between text and image, that text and image don't go totally like parallel. And once you shift things like that, so like, for example, in Communicating Vessel, you have a very, like the narrative is very chronological time, but then the image, the time of the image, the editing time of the image is not chronological, it's the reverse. So you have the 2 girls that we saw at the very beginning, they're naked, they're doing the performance, but then later on you see them rehearsing. And so it's like things are not, like it's not linear. And so I think this linearity, like avoiding linearity, avoiding like one code to be the core of the thing is really what drives the edit and the writing, and that I think the thing that we are the most interested in. And it's also like showing within all this strategy, making them apparent. So there is this making, and I think like you see us making while you are watching the film.
Yeah, and I think one of the structures that we talk about in terms of like a point of reference for editing is, or for constructing, is the constellation as being our sort of like guiding structure, which, means sort of like many points, many elements that are in a non-linear relationship with each other. And then, the amazing thing about film is that it's, by definition, it's linear, right? It has a beginning and it has an end, and it has to move in a straight line from the beginning to the end. So I think in a way it ends up being a really amazing form for activating the constellation within, because the 2 structures kind of put each other in evidence or something. So and even when we're thinking structurally, with the 2 films, we actually, with Communicating Vessels and Out There, we tried to make films with sort of like opposite structures, in that Communicating Vessels begins with, a very traditional, like a character speaking to camera, who's an actress. And then the film, as it progresses, it sort of progressively falls apart. There's a moment where there's all the things that Maïder was saying, where we see the rehearsal, and then at a certain moment, Maïder and I become part of the image, and then you see us making the film, and then everything sort of like falls apart. And then in the end, it's this sort of big mess where nothing is what it seemed in the beginning. And then in Lozano, we tried to move in the opposite direction, where we started with a mess, and then we tried to work our way towards something that behaved like a film. At the end of the Lozano, after you pass through all of the archival material and a sort of performative part with the 2 of us working through the notebooks, and a moment where we're talking to an astrologer about Lozano and her life, then we end up with an image of an actress who's sort of acting out some of the gestures that Lozano recorded in her notebook. So it sort of like moves towards a traditional film. So I think we're conscious of structure, and we're conscious of editing. And I think editing is something we both take a lot of pleasure in, the writing that happens during the editing. But, sometimes we're trying to work against the narrative expectations of the film form.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, this reversal that you talk about, where you've got quite a 3-part narrative structure to the story, in inverted commas, of the first film of Communicating Vessels. And I wonder if like there's a conscious turn away from narrative, or if it's always about kind of playing with that possibility and then turning it on its head.
I think we're trying to like have it all. We're trying to have our cake and eat it too. I think we both really love sort of structuralist film, the possibilities introduced into film through the structuralist film moment in America in the 60s and 70s. But we also, we're totally nourished by narrative and by reading and by literature a lot, actually. That has always been a foundation of our collaboration and our friendship, is to read things and pass books between us. So I think we're really interested we love narrative, but we want to like open it up and make other things possible with it. Like one of our favorite forms of literature that together, I know I can say this on your behalf too, Maïder, is we love the poet's novel. Like when you take a poet like Ben Lerner or Eileen Miles or Lisa Robertson or who else is on our list? Poet novels. And you have these people who are obsessed with, as poets, who are obsessed with structure and a language in a very, very focused way. And then they make an attempt to do something that is a bit looser, like in the novel, moving from poetry to novel. I think is always a revelation. Or like Ocean Vuong, it's the same. There's something about the poet's novel that is, I find, just like really electrifying. So I kind of think maybe that's what we're sometimes trying to do, something equivalent to that.
I think it's like the agency of the words, I think that's what we try to do when we listen to Lozano. We have an audio and then like we add words, and so like we know that if you take language in a way that I think poets, do, in a way that is not just about meaning, it's about form, and it's about rhythm, and it's about, how many mise en page or whatever, all that. So that's what it is. And I think that's our relationship to language is in that way, I think, in a potentiality of not being just about meaning, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you talk about the poet novel. I mean, I hadn't thought about it before, but like you're interested in the outsider artist, and I think that that's kind of an impossibility now, and the poet is perhaps the last sort of remaining outsider creator, in terms of the fact that there's not really a big publishing. Like poets never really fully sell; they're reliant on small presses. So that's quite interesting in terms of that sort of communication between an outsider and then their attempt to access maybe a different part of a more industrial part in terms of in their writing of a novel. I don't know what you think about that, but maybe just in terms of outsiderness and your fascination about outsider art, like do you think that there's a possibility now to be an outsider artist? And I guess yeah, I don't know. I'm not saying that you're trying to be an outsider artist, but I'm asking what maybe your fascination is with outsider artistic practice in the current moment.
I mean, it's a strange term. I think we're interested in, people that are sort of like help define the edges of what's possible in the art world. So I don't think they're not like, Lozano wasn't really an outsider. She was just a troublemaker, and she was a figure of resistance, but she wasn't an outsider. She was totally, she had a show at the Whitney, you know what I mean? She hung out with Dan Graham and, Robert Smithson and, Lucy Lepard. Like she wasn't an outsider artist, but she was both inside, and she was inside, but she wasn't content to stay inside. And I think that's what makes her especially fascinating. And it's a bit similar with this character, the student character in Communicating Vessels, who we call E, who's sort of like has this natural capacity to understand and produce images. And yet some part of her just doesn't fit into, into the art world. And I think what that does when you have those people is it shows what's not working about the art world or the world in general. In fact, when you show the people that can't stand to be within it or won't be admitted within it, you're talking about the limitations of that community or that place.
Yeah, then like the outils, the tools, kind of like tools to reveal, to reveal the limits, or to reveal the hypocrisy, or to reveal, I don't know. They're just showing their active presence, who show what is maybe there to be questioned. That's, I think, what Lozano does. She's just there. She's there. She's there. She's occupying space, and she's just like making all this space that is kind of defined by all these codes and rules and power and dominations, and she's just making all that appear. She just reveals that just by being there. And I think the character of E is just like showing the limits of what the school can do, what school, like the other thing that we know also as teacher, we are faced to. So she's just, so they're very, very precious in that way of being révélateur and keeping things open.
But also I think it's about like the urgency of the figures that are the marginal characters or the outsiders, that, it's not at all cynical. I think it's really easy for artists to like eviscerate the art world and be really flip about it and be very cynical in your depiction of the art world. Obviously it's incredibly easy to do, but I think Maïder and I are both actually not very cynical about it, and we know that, or we feel like there's something vital and essential in trying to keep on making art, and trying to, look at other people's art and understand it, and be in connection and in communication with the world through art making. So I think our attachment to these characters is also about like rejecting a certain cynical relationship to the work that we've chosen and, the communities that we're part of.
Because actually, I think the outsiders we are interested in are, they really, really, really deep believe in art,
And that was, that's the foundation of our friendship too. We met at an art school, and we just sort of like, it was, in that moment of doing your grad studies where you're really, for the first time, sort of mixing, learning how to be an artist with actually imagining what your professional life is going to be. And there's a sort of confrontation, between those two things. And, our friendship was so much about being in rejection of the sort of like careerism and the professionalism that we felt was being imposed on us, in a way that's like, I know now, like, had a lack of maturity about it in a way. But I think it also, I think it's like our common struggle there still kind of echoes through the stuff that we make together, I think.
Should we see if there's any questions from the audience?
Sure.
How does that work? Do they comment or what? It's been so long since I've done a Zoom.
Yeah, if anyone does have a question that they want to ask, I would happily take you off mute if you want to ask the question out loud, or you can use the chat function and just type in a question and share it in the chat. There's also a Q&A box, so really there's so many avenues, but I welcome anyone to use any of them. If you want to put your hand up to ask a question out loud, that's how we can do it that way.
Maybe if nothing comes, I can ask maybe like Daniella with your work and all the films, amazing films that you create in in another screen. And I would be curious about like what you like in terms of like we have this kind of patron that we like and of course they could be lots of filmmakers. And I was wondering how you like the question that you asked us, like this position, this outsider position, the possibilities in terms of the film world. How do you, like with the film that you actually show, what do you feel about it today?
Oh, it's really sweet to ask me a question. I feel I've thrown off. I don't know what to say. No, I would say like in relation to the question that I just asked you, it's interesting that you talk about cynicism, because I think of my worry is always about fetishism, right? And I think that there's a real temptation to fetishize these outsider artists, or indeed artists who probably had mental health issues, but but who, if they were men, would be considered geniuses, right? But were completely rejected by dint of the fact that they were women. So my worry in programming, and just to briefly say what I do, I run a sort of streaming platform of women filmmakers, mostly who have been sort of overlooked or whose work hasn't been shown very much, even in, they're kind of mostly short works, avant-garde pieces, and they haven't so much been shown in galleries or in a cinematic context either. I think like research, I guess what interests me about your work as well is research, and the many different layers of research and contextualization that one does. And yeah, again, like this kind of willingness to admit that you'll never fully know. But as a programmer, I don't think that's really my role. I think my role is to provide enough context that a viewer can sort of analyze or read the work in any way that they want, but a container, I think, to make sure that this sort of fetishism doesn't happen so easily. Like, I think it's also what I find interesting is to present work which might not fit with the current political climate. Like, I think it's really important to show things that aren't necessarily only speaking to what's currently politically acceptable, or because that shifts all the time. So, for example, I'm not that interested in representation. I'm much more interested in form. Like, I don't think it's very interesting to talk about whether a character, and actually most of what I show is documentary, but I don't think it's very interesting to talk about like whether a character is positively or negatively portrayed, or whether they're complex or not. Like, I think it's more interesting, as you guys are doing, to open up a series of questions, I think, rather than anything that flattens the work. But yeah, maybe I could ask, seeing as no one has any questions, the place of, I guess, mental illness in both of the works, or you could also talk about alternative, inducing different psychological processes in terms of your use of psychedelics, but maybe in terms of mental health, like the ways in which you present both E and Lee, I guess, who are atypical, but again, I don't think you're fetishizing any sort of neurodivergency there, but I guess what your interest in that is, and the ways that you present it in order to not fetishize those things.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting what you said about the way that some of these characters can be flattened out and oversimplified, when even like to the point where a lot of their struggles are sort of like edited out of the official biography. I don't know. I think with Lozano, we had a really good conversation with Ian Mowry, who's a Canadian artist who was with her at NASCAD. And at one point, he made a comment about, he spent a lot of time with her in New York as well. He said something about her struggling psychologically, and we'd been sort of like wondering, it's really, it's hard to tell, or it's hard to, know if you should even make a decision about somebody's psychological state, especially if they're not people you've ever met. But from her notebooks, you feel so close to her. So, he said something about her struggling, and we said, oh, so do you think she had mental health problems? And he said, well, definitely she did. She didn't speak to women for, a decade. That's, that's just like that's a clear indication that she was having some kind of difficulties. But even that, I felt kind of uncomfortable with him saying, just because, I don't know, to even, it's the same with E, to even, to bring those things into your portrait of somebody in a way is doing that thing that we're working against, which is like making the definitive picture, and you can't ever do that for anybody else. So I think it can be part of the conversation, but like you said, I hope we would never want to fetishize it or make it the single foregrounded element of a person, because that's never the way it is. There's a question from Leila Timmins in the Q&A we could answer. She asks, will you talk more about your practices of citation and annotation in the work and in your process of research and working together? Maïder, do you want to?
Can you repeat?
She's asking about our practices of citation and annotation, and how we research and work together, I guess, collaboratively.
I think the citation and quotation is that's what we exchange, because we exchange, we're friends and we are collaborators. So I think that's totally part of the base of our relationship, right? Exchanging books, exchanging images, exchanging stories, so it's kind of normal that when we started making work, we could have, all these things that we talk about and they appear in our work. I think I never really thought about it that way, but I think it's very linked to this very basic way that we interact, I think, together. And then after it's more elaborated in the process and in the, but it's, I think, the same way that we think the self shouldn't be looked at this totally autonomous thing, and it's I think that citation, and it's just acknowledging that autonomous in your work, and your work is so filled by other works, and even my words are filled by others, and myself is filled by others. Like I said earlier on, I think that's a totally it's a strong belief that we have in terms of the self not being étanche, quoi. So I think the citation and can be read in that way, and in terms of collaboration, I think it's also it's very organic. We don't really have we do everything. We write together, we edit together. There's no one is doing this and the other is doing that. It's we do everything. I don't know if it's more precise or.
We have made it to 3:01, so we've filled this hour so quickly, or you have. I don't see any other questions in the queue, so we can wrap it up here. Daniella, thanks so much for framing this conversation for us and bringing forth some really interesting lines of questioning, and to Annie and Maïder for generously sort of sharing your art making process and how you've worked together to create these films. It was really fascinating and lovely to hear you talk together. So thank you for that. And thanks everyone for coming out in the audience. It was nice to have you here for the hour and for this afternoon. And I hope if you haven't had a chance to come see the show that you will get an opportunity to come out to Oshawa and see the Beyond Within.